Most people are staring at the ceasefire and asking the wrong question. They want to know who won the public relations round, who blinked first, who gets to declare peace from a podium. That is the surface. The real story sits underneath it in damaged runways, drained missile stocks, and a very old Iranian fighter jet that may have punched a hole through the myth of American invulnerability. The trigger for this reassessment is a major report from CBS News, built on leaks from current and former officials tied to the Pentagon. According to that investigation, Iran's early retaliatory strikes caused far more damage to the United States military infrastructure in the Gulf than has been publicly admitted, not a little more, a lot more. The report claims that more than 100 targets were hit across bases in multiple Gulf states during the opening phase of hostilities. It also states that an Iranian F-5 fighter, a Cold War aircraft, derived from a design first built in the late 1950s, breached air defenses and struck Camp Buehring in Kuwait. And if that account holds, then this was not just a tactical embarrassment, it was a strategic message. Think about what that means. An aircraft associated with another era, flown by a military that Washington and Tel Aviv repeatedly described as crippled, managed to penetrate a defense architecture built around the assumption of total American air superiority. That is not a footnote. That is a crack in the whole design. Facilities reportedly damaged included hangars, runways, radar sites, and command nodes in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Repair costs, according to the same reporting, are expected to run into the billions of dollars. That is the kind of number that does not stay buried forever, because eventually concrete, electronics, and supply chains send their own bills. The symbolism is brutal. For decades, the working assumption in Washington has been that the United States can project air power anywhere in the region, impose escalation at will, and absorb retaliation without suffering meaningful operational disruption. The F-5 story, if accurate, does not merely challenge that assumption, it humiliates it. The aircraft in question traces back to 1959, more than 6 decades old, and yet in this telling, it still found a way through a wall of advanced sensors, interceptors, command networks, and layered defenses that cost incomparably more than the plane itself. That is the larger point. This war was never only about missiles and drones streaking across the sky. It was also about exchange ratios, about cost curves, about whether a highly engineered military machine can survive a conflict in which the other side forces it to spend premium interceptors against cheap, persistent, and diverse threats. The public narrative and much of the Western press suggested that Iran had been battered into passivity, that its retaliatory capacity was mostly theatrical, and that its military systems had been degraded beyond serious use. The emerging picture says something else. It suggests an adversary that retained more flexibility, more depth, and more options than Washington wanted anyone to believe. At the same time, the political environment around the conflict has become even more combustible. Donald Trump was reportedly targeted in another assassination attempt, an event that should be condemned on its own terms, because of the chaos such acts can unleash. But in the context of this war, the danger is obvious. Any such shock can be folded into a new narrative of blame, and blame can become pretexts. And that is where the dilemma sharpens. Washington can try to restart hostilities, or it can accept a pause that increasingly appears to favor Iran's position. It does not want the second option, but the first carries a price that recent reporting suggests the United States may be struggling to pay. One of the clearest indicators is munitions consumption. By the account presented in the transcript, the United States has already burned through roughly half of its Patriot interceptors, half of its THAAD interceptors, and a significant share of its Tomahawk and JASSM strike inventory. If those figures are even directionally correct, then the issue is no longer optics, it is logistics. Missile defense looks invincible only when magazines are full. Once inventories thin out, the geometry changes. Aircraft have to fly closer, more often, and under greater risk, which in turn exposes F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s to air defenses that were supposedly already neutralized. That contradiction has become harder to hide. The same political system that boasted that Iran's navy had been obliterated now has to explain why multiple carrier groups remain wary of getting too close to Iran's anti-ship missiles, drones, and ballistic systems. The same officials who implied that Iran's air force was finished now face allegations that a museum-piece jet got through anyway. And this is where the battlefield and the information battlefield start to separate. On television, certainty in leaked reporting, confusion in official statements, total control. Enforce posture and resupply patterns, something much closer to strain. Consider the diplomatic front. Trump first announced direct talks and claimed American representatives were headed to Islamabad to meet Iranian officials. Iran then indicated that its delegation would travel to Islamabad, Muscat, and Moscow, while also signaling that no direct meeting with United States officials in Pakistan was actually on the table. Then came the reversal. Trump declared that he had canceled the trip of his representatives to Islamabad, complained that too much time had been wasted on travel, and insisted that the United States had all the cards while Iran had none. As messaging goes, it was meant to project dominance as statecraft. It sounded rattled. That phrase, "we have all the cards," lands very differently when paired with reports of damaged bases, depleted interceptors, and an enemy still capable of retaliation. If one side truly holds all the cards, it does not need to keep proving it on social media. It simply dictates terms and the other side complies. Iran has not complied. Instead, Tehran's position has remained blunt. It will not negotiate on maximalist United States terms. It will not surrender ballistic missile capability. It will not abandon nuclear enrichment under coercion. It will not agree to a framework that leaves the country strategically naked and permanently vulnerable to future attack. That refusal matters because Washington's preferred terms are not really a peace formula. They are a disarmament script designed to lock in future leverage. In plain language, strip Iran of deterrence now so it can be pressured, threatened, or struck more easily later. Iran understands that. Pakistan understands that. So does everyone else watching. Because if a state accepts that model under fire, it creates a precedent. And precedents on this board travel fast. The United States has been building up militarily across the region, with heavy cargo transfers reportedly moving from Europe and elsewhere into the Middle East over the last day or two. Iran has also claimed that both Israel and the United States have expanded their force posture beyond pre-war levels. The obvious question is whether this signals imminent renewed hostilities or simply a negotiation ploy wrapped in steel. It may be both. Force can be used to attack, but it can also be used to intimidate, to manufacture bargaining leverage, to imply that the next round will be worse unless concessions are made. Now, the problem is that intimidation loses value when the target has already shown a willingness to absorb punishment and still hit back. That is where the Strait of Hormuz enters the frame, not as a slogan but as a structural reality. Iran does not need to invade anyone to alter the global economy. It only needs to maintain credible control over a maritimes choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil flows moved before the latest crisis. That is not a talking point. It is leverage. It means Iran can shape insurance costs, shipping risk, energy pricing, and investor psychology without formally closing the waterway outright. Once those rules are set, they generate revenue and influence. The transcript's argument is that Tehran has already demonstrated enough control over the strait to secure a durable strategic advantage, one that helps finance reconstruction, reinforces independence, and strengthens its position even if no formal peace treaty is reached. That is a serious claim, but it fits the broader pattern. Power in this conflict is measured not just by firepower, but by the ability to set terms of uncertainty. If that reading is correct, then the war has already produced a geopolitical inversion. Washington wanted to weaken Iran and restore deterrence. Instead, Iran may have emerged more central to the region's power balance than before, not because it destroyed the United States, but because it survived, retaliated, and held the choke point. That is why the CBS reporting is so explosive. It suggests that the cost of this campaign is not limited to headlines, casualties, or temporary deployments. It reaches into the reputation of the entire American defense architecture. Take the air war. Earlier accounts already included claims that an F-15 had been shot down before the ceasefire and before a reported rescue mission tied by some observers to a possible uranium seizure operation. The transcript also suggests that additional aircraft losses may eventually be verified. Whether every one of those claims holds up is less important for now than the larger pattern they point to. Iranian air defenses remain active, and American aircraft remain vulnerable. That alone reshapes planning. A war is one thing when a superpower can orbit freely, strike at will, and return to base without meaningful risk. It is another when every sortie must account for layered defenses, uncertain inventories, and the possibility that old assumptions no longer work. This is where the economic logic becomes savage. A military machine that spends massive sums on each interceptor, each sortie, each support system can be bled by an opponent that forces it into constant, expensive reactions. You do not need symmetry for that. You need persistence, volume, and enough survivability to keep the cycle going. That is the exchange ratio problem. A cheaper drone can trigger a costly response. A modest missile can force the deployment of elite platforms. An old fighter jet can impose disproportionate psychological and operational costs simply by proving that penetration is possible. Empires do not only lose by being defeated in one spectacular blow, they can also lose by entering a cost spiral that eats readiness, confidence, and political support at the same time. That is a slower kind of collapse, still collapse. The consequences extend beyond the Gulf. American force withdrawals from South Korea and the broader Asia-Pacific, reportedly tied to the Middle East buildup, create opportunities elsewhere on the board. Naval absences matter, carrier deployments matter, destroyer rotations matter. The United States has spent years using visible naval presence as both symbol and instrument in the South China Sea and around the Taiwan Strait. If those assets are tied down in West Asia, sweating through prolonged deployments meant to intimidate Iran or enforce maritime pressure, then the signal to Beijing changes. It says Washington is stretched. And stretched forces do not become stronger by sitting in extreme heat, under constant threat, on extended duty cycles. The transcript paints a bleak picture of morale among sailors and Marines deployed in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the wider Indian Ocean approach. Bad conditions, long exposure, poor food, deteriorating motivation. Maybe some of that is anecdotal, maybe some of it is overstated, but no military can remain indefinitely at high alert in punishing conditions without paying a human price. The weather is not trivial. Ask anyone who has served in those waters during peak heat. Equipment strains, tempers shorten, fatigue accumulates, judgment erodes. Professor Mohammed Marandi, cited in the transcript, reportedly warned that the hot season will turn deployment into hell. That may sound dramatic, but military history is full of campaigns shaped as much by climate and morale as by missiles and maps. Men and machines both break down. There were also references to the Gerald Ford having experienced behavior bordering on mutiny before the strikes around February 28th. That is difficult to verify in full, but even the existence of such allegations matters. They feed a narrative of a force that is not merely overcommitted, but increasingly unconvinced. Morale on the home front compounds the problem. Public support for another prolonged war with Iran appears thin. Trump's approval ratings, as described in the transcript, are weak across multiple categories, including the economy, foreign policy, and trust in the administration. J.D. Vance, according to the same account, polls as one of the least popular figures in the administration. Whether those specific standings shift by the week is almost beside the point. The broad effect is stable. There is no broad public appetite for a major war. That matters because domestic legitimacy and battlefield endurance are connected. Vietnam made that painfully clear. In the transcript, the speaker recounts his father's experience after the Tet Offensive, drafted and sent to Vietnam during the period from 1969 to 1971, where morale was low, discipline frayed, and the will to fight had eroded badly. The comparison should not be abused. Iran is not Vietnam. The military structure is different. The media environment is different. The nature of the war is different. But the principle holds. Once soldiers, sailors, and the public no longer believe the mission has a coherent purpose, the machinery of war starts grinding against itself. That is the hidden attrition, not just spent missiles, spent belief, spent legitimacy, spent patience. The transcript pushes this further, describing the United States as an oligarchic system driven by monopolists, bankers, and the military-industrial complex, rather than by any stable conception of the public good. That is a polemical formulation, but it captures a widespread perception. Even as the strategic case weakens, institutional momentum keeps dragging policy toward escalation. Iran, meanwhile, is pressing a diplomatic offensive. It continues to build ties with Pakistan and to widen channels independent of Washington. That is significant because under older rules, the United States not only dominated wars, it also dominated mediation. Even third parties typically worked within an American frame. That frame is weakening. Pakistan may want de-escalation and a negotiated outcome, but it is not reportedly pushing Iran to accept surrender terms. That is a subtle but important shift. In the old order, smaller states often acted as transmission belts for American demands. In the emerging order, they are more careful. They see the risks of asking one state to disarm itself completely under coercion, because tomorrow they could be the ones being asked. This is why the conflict has implications far beyond the Gulf. If Iran proves that a regional power can absorb a major military campaign, refuse maximalist terms, and still preserve strategic autonomy, then every targeted state in the global South will study that model. Cuba will study it. Venezuela will study it. So will Russia, China, and every government living under some version of American pressure. The lesson is not that everyone can replicate Iran's military capabilities. Most cannot. The lesson is that political will, strategic patience, and carefully cultivated deterrence can complicate even the most formidable war machine. The transcript makes this point explicitly when it argues that Iran is now fighting not only for itself, but for the shape of political, military, and economic resistance for generations to come. That is a grand claim. Yet in geopolitical terms, wars often become larger than the territory they directly involve because they test methods, thresholds, and limits. This one is testing whether the United States can still dictate surrender terms to an adversary that has real retaliatory power. Thus far, the answer looks less certain than Washington expected. It is also testing the resilience of the so-called multipolar world. Before February 28, many observers were deeply pessimistic. They pointed to setbacks in Syria, pressure on Venezuela, ceasefires that looked like defeats, and a broader sense that the anti-hegemonic camp was constantly on the defensive. Then came Iran's response. Slow at first in public perception, then suddenly impossible to ignore. a demonstration that strategic patience is not the same as weakness, and that waiting does not always mean yielding. That is a hard lesson for media ecosystems trained to interpret every pause as a collapse. Sometimes a pause is exactly that, a pause. Sometimes it is a reload. Sometimes it is an adversary forcing you to spend more than you can comfortably afford while preserving its own core capabilities. The transcript invokes Deng Xiaoping's famous logic of hiding strength and biding time. Whether one applies that directly to Iran is debatable, but the underlying principle fits the moment. Not every power advertises its thresholds. Not every deterrent is displayed in advance. What the war appears to have revealed is that the emerging non-Western power bloc may be sturdier than many assumed. Not invincible. Not unified in every respect, but sturdier. That brings us to the triangular frame the speaker borrows from Pepe Escobar, Russia, Iran, and China as three major pillars of an evolving Eurasian-centered order. The label matters less than the strategic reality. Behind it, these states do not need identical systems or identical goals to complicate American primacy. They only need overlapping interests, enough coordination, and the patience to let overextension do part of the work. In that sense, Iran's ascent is not just regional. It may now be viewed as a larger pillar inside a broader anti-hegemonic matrix, particularly because it has shown a capacity to endure direct pressure rather than only proxy pressure. That changes calculations in Moscow. It changes calculations in Beijing. It changes calculations in capitals that do not want to choose sides but are quietly taking notes. Being in China, as the transcript notes, reinforces part of that conclusion. The argument is blunt. If Washington is struggling to coerce Iran into submission, then coercing China becomes even less plausible, not difficult, not costly, less plausible. China has already crossed thresholds of industrial, technological, and strategic depth that make dreams of regime change or total rollback look detached from reality. The only remaining path for an empire unwilling to accept limits is to damage the surrounding system in the hope that China is damaged with it. That is not a strategy of confidence. It is a strategy of demolition. And demolition has side effects. The global economy is already absorbing repeated shocks: energy insecurity, shipping disruptions, inflation, transmission, insurance spikes, defense spending, escalations, and chronic uncertainty in commodity markets. At some point, the question becomes whether the war machine runs out of military room first, or whether the financial architecture underneath it begins to wobble. That possibility is part of the conundrum. The United States can still do immense damage. Nobody serious should underestimate that. The capacity for destruction remains enormous. And friends of the speaker, such as Brian Berletic, have repeatedly warned against confusing setbacks with incapacity. That warning is worth keeping. An overstretched empire is still dangerous, sometimes more dangerous because it compensates for declining control with bursts of escalation. So yes, another round with Iran remains possible, maybe in 6 months, maybe sooner, maybe after a resupply cycle, a political trigger, or a manufactured incident. Dark humor aside, there's nothing abstract about that risk. Both sides likely need time. The United States needs replenishment, repositioning, and narrative repair. Iran also needs to rebuild, rearm, and absorb the effects of the last exchange. The question is not whether the board resets to peace. It is whether the next phase begins under the same assumptions as the previous one. And here, the answer appears to be no. Too much has been exposed. Too many myths have been punctured. The image of uncontested American dominance has taken hits from multiple angles: damaged bases, finite interceptors, active Iranian air defenses, continued naval caution, diplomatic confusion, and the simple fact that Washington asked for direct talks while insisting it held absolute leverage. Absolute leverage does not need to ask. It commands. It gets results. It does not cancel trips in public. and then insist that everyone else is wasting its time. That is why the language of triumph now sounds hollow. The administration can say it has not even thought about ending the ceasefire or restarting the war. It can say all options remain available. It can say the enemy has been devastated. But credibility is no longer produced by repetition alone. Credibility now runs through material facts, through inventory levels, through shipping lanes, through cratered infrastructure, through how close American aircraft must fly to hit their targets, through whether a 60-plus-year-old jet really did what the leaks say it did. If more leaks emerge, and they likely will, the long-term shape of this war may look uglier than the public was first told. Not because every rumor is true, but because hidden costs in modern warfare have a habit of surfacing late. Once procurement records, satellite images, maintenance logs, and contractor invoices begin to align, and if they do align, then the consequences reach beyond the Gulf. Every ally, every rival, every hedging state recalculates. Insurance underwriters recalculate. Energy traders recalculate. Defense planners recalculate. Voters recalculate. That is how power shifts in the real world, not only through speeches and flags, but through accumulated proof that one side can no longer achieve its declared objectives at a tolerable price. And this is the part pundits hate because it is slower than a headline and harder to spin. For now, the battlefield is quieter. Quieter is not safer. It may simply mean that both sides are counting, repairing, moving stock, rechecking assumptions, and preparing their next line. The old order still has claws, and the new order is still incomplete. But something important has changed. The United States entered this confrontation expecting deference. It got resistance. It expected quick intimidation. It got retaliatory depth. It expected to preserve the image of untouchable air and missile dominance. Instead, according to the reporting now circulating, it may have watched a relic of the Cold War fly straight through the story it had been telling about itself. That is not just a military embarrassment. It is a geopolitical event, because once the myth of invulnerability breaks, everything attached to it becomes negotiable. Alliances, deterrence, energy markets, diplomatic posture, strategic patience, even the price of saying no. And that may be the most consequential revelation of all. Not that Iran won some final victory, not that the United States has lost the capacity to strike, but that the terms of the game are changing in plain sight, and the old scripts are no longer enough to hide it. Somewhere beneath the waterline of the Strait of Hormuz, the balance of risk is still waiting. In damaged Gulf bases, the bill is still being counted. In Washington, the rhetoric still outruns the arithmetic. That is where the truth usually lives. Not in the headline, in the costs, the choke points, and the things officials only admit after the concrete is cracked. So watch the inventories, watch the shipping lanes, watch Islamabad, Muscat, and Moscow, watch carrier movements, repair contracts, and the next leak that slips past the filters. Because this story is not over, the pause is not the ending. It may only be the moment when the world finally sees what the war has already exposed.